All right, welcome. This is our second annual Dissertation Prize interview for the Food Geographies Research Group. And I am Helen Trail, based at the University of Glasgow. And I'm joined today by Jack Pickering. Say hello, Jack.
Hi, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Sheffield.
And we are also joined by Camy Sandford, the winner of this year's Dissertation Prize for her dissertation, which was called Meeting the Mainstream, a critical analysis of meat substitute advertising in the American fast-food industry. And you did that at the University of Edinburgh, didn't you, Camy?
Yes, yeah.
So the judges were really impressed with this. It's a really rich dissertation. It's a really interesting piece of work that looks at advertising and brings together a really interesting range of theoretical tools to draw out how meat substitutes are drawn into the mainstream of the fast food industry within America, particularly drawing on this kind of semiotic analysis of the advertising. And hopefully one of the things we'll be able to get into in this little interview is the process of doing that and how that's kind of affected how you think about advertising and meat substitutes. So just to kick us off, I wondered if you could tell us the story of your dissertation. So where you got the inspiration for your dissertation and what really pushed you to study American fast food advertising?
I was really conscious that because I was going to have to spend so much time doing it, that it would be something that I would be really interested in personally. And so I think really the motivation for it was I did a year abroad in Canada as part of my degree, because Edinburgh's 4 years, so the third year you can choose to take abroad. So I went to North America and I had a North American background, and so I didn't, expect to have a lot of cultural shock. But I have to say, I did experience it sort of on the whole scale. It was so culturally different from the UK. But where I found the most difference, and what I was most surprised about, is that personally, I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat meat. But I also, hands in the air, I love fast food. I love, Big Macs, used to love chicken nuggets, all that stuff. So for me, that was one of the biggest losses of becoming veggie, was that kind of lack of ability to indulge in one of the things that I loved doing in a sort of guilty pleasure way. And then all of a sudden, when I went to North America, every fast food outlet, because of the timing that I was there, had just started bringing out their meat substitute, burgers, not McDonald's, but specifically Burger King and A&W. And they were so tasty. And so I kind of, initially I was clouded by, the taste and the straight enjoyment of it. And then I kind of started to think how odd it was that the cultural differences that I'd experienced everywhere else allowed for this to emerge. And in my head, because of the way I was, I guess, situated, I couldn't really make sense of it. And I also couldn't really make sense of who they were pitching it to. So I started, every time I would go, which, really, it wasn't that often. I'm making it sound like it was every day. It wasn't that bad. But I would kind of look at how they were presenting it. And if you sort of had any experience of North American advertising, you'll know it's quite strong. It's really to the point. It's loud. There's a very particular, often male voice they use across the board that you'll be quite familiar with. So I kind of just started to look at it and think to myself, how are they integrating this, what I think is quite a progressive idea, in a really, really commercialized environment with this new technology that they're able to make it taste amazing. And it kind of just went from there. And once I'd realized that I wanted to do something to do with food in my dissertation, it just made a lot of sense. And I was really encouraged by my supervisor, Ray Rosenberg, to run with that idea, focus on that specific location because of the points of interest that I've mentioned, and really focus on advertising as, I guess, a window into not exactly society as it is, but sort of society as advertisers think it is, and how they are presenting it. Because really, if you think about marketing, apologies, this is a really rambling answer, but if you think about marketing, that they're trying to draw on your assumptions and idealized forms of what they believe based on their market research people in that culture, in that location want. So really, I thought by examining the way they were presented, that I'd be able to figure out what people think of not just vegetarians, but someone who might buy that product, and then what that says conversely about the perceptions they're trying to challenge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you mentioned there was some of the work, some of your sort of, you kind of started to look into sort of food a lot as a sort of subject. So could you tell us about any work on food that particularly really inspired you?
Oh, that's a very good question. One of the sort of deep dives I did into food quite separately was as part of a sociology module, actually. And as we briefly touched about before we started this interview, is that's the great thing about geography, is it intersects so many disciplines. So in that sense, I was really fascinated, firstly by French food culture, which is obviously completely different than what I ended up studying. But I did a sort of deep dive into, I can't remember any specific academics' names, I'm sorry, but about how that affinity with food, both internally and internationally, really shaped French food identity. So that was one of the aspects I found particularly fascinating. I also, in terms of American work specifically, I can't remember who wrote it, but the McDonaldization of society, I think, was one of the terms that I looked at quite a lot. And I don't, what's the name of that Netflix documentary that Super Size Me? There you go.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I found that particularly interesting, and how something that you might think is so not necessarily mundane, but I guess an essential aspect of surviving as a person could take on so much more meaning. And personally, as someone who loves food, I just found the way that intersected academically to be particularly fascinating.
Mm.
There's so much, it's such a broad field. I think it's interesting the way you've got these kind of, there's the French food, and then there's George Ritzer's McDonaldization of society. I think you're right. I think that kind of interdisciplinarity within I think food geographies is one of the things that I find so interesting anyway about working in the general area. So you wrote this really interesting dissertation about American fast-food advertising, but one of the things that I think for me was quite interesting was how thoroughly you talked us through that process of semiotic analysis, and a lot of the detail that went into that. And I wondered a little bit, not to get too bogged down in the actual methodology, but what the process of learning to do that was like for you.
Oh, it's really cool. I mean, I think a methodology is one of the most challenging and rigorous aspects of writing the dissertation, because really, as anyone or most people do who reach that level of study, is that I like to read and I enjoy absorbing other people's ideas, but I was really conscious, and in my discussions with my supervisor, he made me really conscious and kind of look at academic work in a different way, which this is going to sound really basic, but I was very conscious of the fact that someone was going to read this and they needed to understand it, and they would not have spent 100 hours reading about American fast food. And so I thought it was really, really important to get a very structured methodology from the outset. But at the same time, what I wanted to do was very ambitious, and it wasn't I couldn't find anything that had been done that was similar before, which was great in a way. But it was so complicated that finding one lens to look at it through proved quite impossible. So I integrated a few methodologies, as I said. Kind of semiotic was the main frame because of my subject matter, which was advertising, which is very symbolic. They draw in a lot of, not necessarily subconscious levels, but it's overt and yet very subtle in its symbolism. So that's why I picked that as the most applicable. But I was very conscious, because of the subject matter I was dealing with was to do with gender and sex, was to do with racial aspects as well, that I integrate those feminist and eco-feminist lenses in doing that. So trying to find a way that balanced all of those aspects was quite hard. And involved a lot of reading, and I think importantly a lot of, I was going to use the word networking, but consultation and the seeking of guidance from people within the university who'd done semiotics before. which I think is a really important aspect that probably students should be more encouraged to do, is to reach, that also sounds very obvious, but to reach out to people who may have used certain methodologies before, and they can really talk you through how you might be able to apply it, and importantly the limitations of doing so, which is something also I feel like is important to keep in mind, the reach of what you're going to say.
Yeah.
I think academics, oh sorry Jack, I interrupted you, but I was just going to say I think academics are also just usually really happy to talk about their research too, so
yeah, exactly.
Quite like nerding out about your work.
Yeah, I was just go on.
No, go for it, Jack.
I just want to say I loved like how clear your analysis was as well. Like every step of it you like walked through, and then having the like interpretant matrix at the end in the appendices. That was so nice to sort of see that all laid out. Because I think when you described it, it was quite kind of a difficult sort of concept to like sort of imagine, but then you had it so well laid out. It was yeah, incredibly clear. I think sometimes analysis can be a bit of like a black box process in like some academic writing, and you did such a good job of like just taking it to bits and showing us all how it worked. So
oh, thank you. I think going back to the sort of previous question about methodology, that's why it's also so important, I think, to speak to people about it, because often, and I'm guilty of this as well, when I'm reading a paper and maybe I'm short on time, that I don't really read the analysis methodology in great detail. I read the sort of bare bones of it, but in terms of seeing people's appendices or going into great detail, I think people often don't do that when they're reading for information rather than method. And so it was really important to me that I try and make it as clear as possible. So if anyone else was doing it, that it would be clear, or was reading it, where I got my assumptions from, rather than just kind of off the cuff assuming that I'd done the work.
Yeah, no, that's it's great. Yeah, really good on you for that. Yeah, so one of the other things I really liked about your thesis as well was that you brought up like how central sort of meat is to like American culture, and like vice versa, and the sort of relationship between the two, the sort of meat and nationality aspect. So I've always found that really fascinating. But I was just wondering, did you think about and did you like talk about sort of other cultures that in their relationship with meat and sort of inside the American sphere? I think Helen could probably feed in a bit more on this as well.
Yeah, I guess just the conversation that Jack and I briefly had before you arrived, actually, Camy, was just that there are these different, like, I guess a lot of them are immigrants as well. So I guess some of that is also to do with the way the power figures through mainstream food culture. But I think that, like, I think the thing that really struck me was the way that kind of Latino identity was kind of pulled through the taco adverts as well. And I guess there's quite a lot of rich diversity, I suppose, within the American food scene. And I just wanted to hear you talk more about it.
Oh, that's a very good question. And I feel like that's probably something, had I had more space, that I would have liked to delve into a bit deeper. I'm sure you guys know from doing it yourselves that trying to cut everything down to the right amount of words is a really challenging process. And I find it really hard because I had a lot more to say, of which I can't specifically remember at the moment. But yeah, I think in the American situation particularly, I found what I would call a slightly uneasy marriage of other cultures with the fast food culture. That might have just been because of the lens through which I was looking at it, but particularly in the Latino case, I thought that it felt slightly appropriated in the fast food sense, and that was purely because of the kind of commercial lens that I was looking at it through. And bearing in mind that I am not part of that culture, so I can't speak to the intricacies of it. And I think that's kind of the point, is that advertising by nature simplifies things. And so by not only taking another culture and, I would put quotation marks, melding this into the very Americanness that is fast food, really, because of its origins, I felt like was at risk of simplifying not only that other culture itself, but of the relationship between the two and the power dynamics between the two of them. Because if you think about not even just in monetary, but as kind of evident from my research, the cultural impacts that the very American conglomerate nature of fast food has throughout not just America, but I guess the world by proxy, I think that is something that is in danger of being missed in that circumstance. So I think that was really to boil it down to a nutshell, the overall impression I got from the very specific sector that I was looking at. But it is something that I wish I'd gone into in a little bit more depth, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I suppose like you say, it's so much of it there. How do you fit it in? How do you, what do you choose how to cut? It would be difficult to navigate as well. So there's lots of challenges there. Yeah, and
also it's an important topic to navigate sensitively as well. Like, I'm very conscious, and I was including in my methodology kind of acknowledging where I'm looking from, my own background, my own personal perceptions of meat as a vegetarian, of these offerings, of, my parents being North American, so my cultural link in that sense. So yeah, I think it's something that's difficult to speak about in such a large scale without doing a proper deep dive, probably through ethnography or kind of collaboration with others who may be inside the cultures that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think there is that, you really get that sense of the sensitivity with which you kind of approach the materials to, you're really clear about your positionality within the field, which particularly for a kind of a semiotic analysis is perhaps a bit rarer than you would in a methodology that's perhaps more about actually interacting face to face with people. I wanted to ask whether and how your research has changed how you engage with adverts, because sometimes when you research a subject, you start to respond to it slightly differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. And I feel like it was always something that I was quite interested in, just because have you ever played the advert game, sort of between TV breaks, where you try and guess the company that's the adverts for? So I always used to play that, but I play it probably even more now. But I really noticed the fine print of what people are saying to me, and I think I take it much more with a pinch of salt. And particularly, I think it's a really interesting subject given kind of GDPR and the sale of data and the rise of personalized adverts. And I think I view that really differently now, because I'm very conscious of the fact that they are targeting what some metric has told them is my personality, my living habits, my shopping habits, etc. So I think that's particularly interesting, because what I was talking about was national kind of blanket advertising, but now, because they're so particular, I think, especially when you're dealing with something like semiotics, where it's all about how you interpret a sign, and the fact that they're now tailoring that to what they think I'm going to respond to as a personality, I think that's really interesting, and I'm definitely more conscious of that. Not that I've explored that necessarily academically, but yeah, I think I'm more conscious of what they're trying to do. But I wouldn't say I apply a semiotic analysis in a sort of everyday fashion. I think I don't really have time.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, how much time would you have left if you just were constantly doing a semiotic analysis?
Yeah,
exactly. That's all there is. And you're right, they're everywhere, they're personalized, they're targeted. You do that forever.
Has it changed how you think about food at all? I suppose, sort of vegetarian food as well.
Yeah, I think I am, particularly because of the sort of sociological research that I did. This is kind of aside to the dissertation, but I think a lot more about food and relationships, and how I particularly use food to, have friends over, and it structures basically my whole day for when I'm hungry. When I see people is often at lunchtime. So I'm very conscious of my relationship with food. In terms of my relationship with fast food, now that McDonald's has the McPlant, it's still very strong in the UK. I think I probably think more carefully about it, but as someone who always loved food, I think it hasn't changed super significantly, to be honest. It's just more, I'm conscious of more of a macro sense of why I may be doing what I'm doing in relation to it, if that makes sense.
I suppose this probably ties into the kind of the broader ethics really of the work. There is this quite important, I guess, ethical thread that runs through the dissertation about, you know, what happens when you take this kind of alternative food, this alternative diet that is usually framed around kind of an ethical position, whether that's animal welfare or environmental concern. So when you take that kind of vegan or vegetarian diet and when you put it into the mainstream, into this incredibly commercialized environment, I just wondered if the work had challenged you to think differently about food ethics or about kind of vegetarianism or veganism more generally.
Yeah, I think I thought a lot more about why I was doing it, because I've been vegetarian for a number of years, and often when I say that to people, their first response is to ask me why, and to which I never really have a concrete response, because essentially it's a bit of everything. First and foremost, I never actually particularly liked meat, so it's not a challenge for me. And I think because of that, I don't frame myself as a particularly alternative and ethical because of my vegetarianism person, if that makes sense. Not that I think of myself as unethical, but I don't think, from my perspective, it doesn't add particular ethical value to my character. But I was really conscious that, particularly from a vegan perspective, that it really did. So I think exploring that and being conscious of how my consumption would affect other people is something that I'm quite interested in. And particularly as more of my friends and acquaintances are becoming vegan, I've been really interested to see how they respond to people in their space eating meat and eating animal products. And I think a few of my friends actually did their dissertations about ethical veganism and militant veganism and aspects like that, and how that translates to social media, which, as an aside, was very interesting. But I don't think it's particularly changed my consumption patterns, if I'm being honest. But I think I am more conscious about how other people perceive me, actually. I think that's why I really took from it, is that I hadn't really realized how much a dietary identity can change the way other people think about you and what they assume your lifestyle is because of, or what you may think of them. I don't know if that makes sense.
That's really interesting, yeah. So what was the most sort of kind of interesting finding from your research? Is there anything that you kind of would like want to like investigate more?
Well, I think the relationships between men and meat I found particularly interesting. I think that from doing more and more reading about it, it's something that seems in retrospect very obvious. And personally, from my own relationships with like my guy friends, basically, now examining them through my academic lens, I'm very conscious of the fact that they eat a lot of meat. And then not that they particularly would sit there and have a steak and exclaim that they are very masculine, but how that is an aspect that is so ingrained, I feel, in our society. So I think that's something that I would love to delve more deeply into, more broadly, not just in the kind of fast food space, and how that's impacting people. And I think I found a particularly fascinating element about how they'd been framed, was the fact that they were just trying to appeal to the male audience, and by kind of shrouding the meat substitute in this meat identity. And in that sense, as you said, Helen, kind of losing that alternative nature and losing what had previously been a feminine identity from a vegetarian perspective. So I think, yeah, that's definitely something that I would love to delve more deeply into. And in the same sense, kind of the relationships between the meat and masculinity and the family unit. That might sound quite particular, but one of the real images that came to my mind during my research was, particularly in the American context, the picture of you can't see me, but I'm doing quotation marks, nuclear family of you know, a mum and a dad and kids, and them being that family unit with a meat dish on the table that the dad would have purchased, the dad would have carved at the table, and that being that real structure on which the previous, again quotes, foundation of American society was built, on that assumption of that unit working like that. So I think if I had unlimited time, I would love to delve more deeply ethnographically into that relationship between the meat, the man, and the family, and how that's changed, particularly.
That's really interesting. I suppose you could almost approach it from a lens of like looking at different types of families, and like, I mean, it's not so much the case anymore, but what used to be called like non-traditional family types, and and then if they engage the meat differently as well, if they do eat meat, that would be really interesting. Yeah,
and I also think to the earlier points about different cultures and how food fits into cultural identity in a much more diverse society, essentially. So I think that would also be a really interesting lens through which to analyze how relationships are being built and how people are perceiving each other because of the way their families work around food and around meat and around masculinity. I think that would be really interesting. Oh, bearing in mind that's a huge undertaking and that's a very broad topic.
I mean,
PhD thesis,
I think you've just queued yourself up for a PhD. and I think the flip side is interesting too. So you've got the male, the masculine, the meat consumption, and then you also have, like, I guess the idea of kind of feminized care and food care is this concept that's been developed like relatively recently, about the way that particularly mothering and intensive mothering can be brought about through certain kind of food practices. So I guess we can think about those kind of the way that culture and food are so tightly bound that we tend to reproduce a lot of the kind of the heteronormative power dynamics within our food behaviors as well. But it sounds super interesting, so I look forward to you doing your PhD. No, more seriously, I did want to ask whether you had any kind of further plans for the future academically. You mentioned just before we started recording that you were doing a postgrad in real estate, and I wondered if you saw any kind of lines of continuity through your dissertation, through your undergrad, and into the master's that you're doing.
Yeah, I think the lines of continuity would be much more about the sort of broader geographical similarities rather than so much about food, just because I work in commercial real estate in London. So in that sense, professionally, a lot of what I do revolves around place, as I specifically work in a location team. So it's really helped the way I approach projects, I think, how I approach stakeholders, how I consider people's relationship in the area. I think that's a massive transferable learning that from my undergrad studies to my later life. In terms of my I mean, my master's is pretty similar. It's very practical, it's very different in its approach. It's geography was as a lot of undergrads are, I guess, but quite theoretical, a lot of reading, where my master's is more practical and much more report based. But I think the way you approach space, and bearing in mind that property and real estate is by nature, it's tangible. It's, you know, it's there, it's in a space, in a place, people live there, people work there, people move around, and that's where all of this, you know, we've spoken about family, we've spoken about food and the home, and where people make relationships and kind of establish who they are. And I guess from that perspective, this all happens inside a place, inside a building. So I think the way that I think about even a commercial benefit or a social benefit, or how this might fit politically, and all of that in my postgrad studies, I definitely brought forward from geography. In terms of my plans to pursue postgrad in geography, I don't know. I think that might be unlikely at this stage of my life, but never say never.
Never say never. Well, Jack and I are obviously very interested in your ideas about the masculine meat in the family. So you can keep us posted if you do pursue
I
it.
will.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been so interesting to hear a bit more about the process of dissertation, and yeah, best of luck with your future studies.